Welcome back to MLK, the Rhetoric and Theology of Nonviolent Social Change for the spring semester of the 2019 academic year. The first iteration of this course, I believe, was in spring 2014. As an honors colloquia, I taught it twice in summer. Believe it was it 15 and 16, and then it was in the spring of 2018. So this would be about the fifth time that we've had this course at Tennessee Tech. We've landed in the College of Interdisciplinary Studies, and it does have the RELS prefix, so it is a religious studies course. And that does mean I will talk quite freely about the Christian tradition of which Dr. King is from. I'll talk about other religious traditions too, because Dr. King himself was a person who respected and learned from other religious traditions. But it won't be, a thing if I just, start quoting the Bible or talking about Jesus. And if I slip into my preacher mode, please forgive me, but that might happen. So the word rhetoric, which is one of the titles of the course, simply means the art of argument. The art of argument. And people who are in advertising, definitely preachers of the gospel, people who speak for a living, are rhetoricians. In our society, you may have noticed that the word rhetoric has taken on a bad connotation among some circles, and you might have even heard the saying, "Oh, that's just rhetoric," or "I'm so tired of all the rhetoric." That's in part because we're living in a culture war. Some people have even said we're on the verge of another civil war in the United States, but we're definitely living in a culture war. And when it became that you can curate your news sources by your political ideology, that became worse. And so in the era of Fox versus MSNBC, for example, the idea of a curated ideological media environment where people argue professionally, this idea of rhetoric being negative is problematic. But for King's sake, we mean rhetoric in the best sense of the word, the artful use of words and language in argument. And one of your three major papers, I believe it's paper number 2, you will actually be asked to analyze a King speech from the perspective of rhetoric. Theology simply means the study of God. I had a guy show up from Greece. He's a member of our tennis team in my literature course this semester. His name is Theo, and I said, that actually means God. Did you know you were going to show up in class and sit next to God today? It's like in our friends in Mexico, oftentimes a common male name is Jesus. I have a pastor friend from Georgia, from Atlanta, Georgia, lives in Baltimore now, named Ed Loring. I remember I did some work with him in a homeless community that he served in Atlanta many years ago. I was working with him, and we had a gentleman lived with us named Jesus, and I think Ed was just being clever, but whenever Jesus would walk in the room, Ed would say, with his thick southern accent, "How's it going, Jesus?" Because that was just his name. But theology just simply means the study of God. So bios means life. So biology means the study of life. And I think we have a sociologist in the room, and she mentioned, sociology. Sociology means the study of society. So theology simply means the study of God. And we have in America a strong sensibility of the separation of church and state, and in a public university, some people think religious studies should be off limits. But I believe strongly that academics should study God in an academic way. And when we don't, I think that cedes religious discourse to non-academic forms. And nothing against the First Amendment rights of the South Patio preacher, but you're aware of his use of rhetoric is very extreme. He preaches a Turner Byrne kind of hell-based theology, and he's provocative in his invocation of sin, and he attacks college students and calls them all kinds of names and things of this nature. And it's my strong belief that as academics, if we see the theology only to the street preachers, and again, I'm not saying that that's wrong, that a person is preaching on the street. I admire his kind of audacity if I don't even respect his content so much, that particular man's content. But the audacity of a street preacher, I have nothing against that. But I think academics should study God and theology and religion because I think it elevates the discourse. And when you study Martin Luther King, you really, I think, need to do this in part because he was a professionally trained theologian. And he was really informed by his own academic study of theology. And also, when I designed the course, one of my first mentors in designing the course really encouraged me to focus on areas in which I had some professional training, and I'm professionally trained, academically trained, in both rhetoric and theology, and so that's how we sort of settled on this approach to the course. But we're going to be looking at rhetoric and theology in the application known as nonviolent social change. And I've already heard a few of you mention as we went around in your motives for the course that you really wanted to look at this, this thing called social change. We talk about it. I could talk a good game about social justice, but actual social activism that results in tangible, transformative change is actually a rarer thing maybe than it should be. Actual successful social change is hard to come by. There's a lot of social intransigence, a lot of social stagnance, a lot of social apathy. But actual social change is kind of a big deal. It doesn't happen as often as we maybe would like it to. It certainly doesn't happen just because we tweet about it. Social slacktivism, as it's been called, social media activism, rhetorically is important. I'm not against it, but it's not the same thing as deep social change. And Dr. King, during those years that I bracketed on one of the early slides, 1955 to 1968, was actually wildly successful on many of his campaigns in bringing about actual change. He eliminated most forms of overt legal racism through his movement. And he's not a one-man movement by any means, even though this is a course focused on him and his legacy and his commitment. But the movement of which he was a part, the movement that made him, the movement made Martin as much as Martin made the movement, is one of the things I like to say. But that real change happened from that movement. It wasn't abstract, it wasn't pretend, it wasn't temporary. Permanent, long-lasting, meaningful, positive social change happened because of Dr. King and the movement that he participated in, and it was done through a philosophy of peaceful resistance. And at least one of you mentioned, I want to understand why nonviolence was so important to King. I want us to, especially next week when we get into the Montgomery bus boycott, and we'll talk about it a little bit at the end of class today if I have time for the excerpt I want to share with you. Excuse me. But the kind of commitment that nonviolence took is not the same kind of commitment it takes us just not to curse or not to call names or not to engage in physical violence in our daily lives. He was kind of a commander-in-chief of a nonviolent army that was in combat with hostile forces that were threatening his life on a daily basis. And so the kind of profound spiritual commitment to love and nonviolence that King took on is just wild, okay? So we're going to learn about that. King, in the early parts of the book, and I've put the page numbers that I want you all to use on the autobiography and the speeches book on your syllabus. But in the early part of the book, King goes through a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today. But he references Hank here, or Henry David Thoreau, who was a 19th century white activist in the Northeast. He's kind of quaint by today's standards, but he was very ahead of his time and very bold in some of the things that he did. But Henry David Thoreau, you maybe had to study him in high school because of Walden Pond. And that's kind of, it's kind of like a tree hugger manifesto about becoming one with nature and living more simply. You've maybe heard the saying, live simply that others may simply live. Thoreau's like the guy of less is more, of loving nature, seeing the divine in nature, being at peace with wilderness and the animal kingdom, and being a steward responsibly of our resources. But he protested taxes that he believed contributed to slavery. So he was an abolitionist. And he was willing to go to jail for his beliefs. And so he wrote this beautiful essay that King read in college that's profoundly important in King's learning that would make him the figure that he is. And that was this idea of nonviolent civil disobedience, moral resistance, breaking an unjust law. If the law is wrong, the outlaw is right. See, isn't that crazy? That's strange, right? We think of law-abiding citizens as the good people, but if the laws are immoral, illegal, outrageous, cruel, unjust, and in our cases, not recognizing the full humanity of the former slaves in our society, and then it was the time of the slaves. I mean, not recognizing the full humanity of women even was a thing back then. I mean, not recognizing the full humanity of people who were not white male landowners. I mean, it's crazy when you read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, with which King so eloquently brought into his repertoire, that it originally didn't apply to everybody. I mean, the democracy was for an elite of men, of rich men, of white men only, not Native Americans, the Indians. They weren't part of the founding of the country, even though it was their land. Those who were, considered to be property. If you have an opportunity and you've never been to one of the great civil rights museums, and now they're all over the United States. I just found out they're building a new one in Nashville, actually, a national soul music, black music, African-American music museum is going to be in Nashville. But if you go to the Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, if you go to the museum in Birmingham or some of the museums in Atlanta, they'll show you what the actual practice of slavery actually looked like for those who were brought here against their will. It's not a nice thing. This isn't a nice part of American history. This is terrorism. This is kind of sin writ large. It is a violation of God. And so when Thoreau protested, there's this, and I'm sure this saying, the story, I'm going to probably mess it up. I'm not reading directly from a source here. But basically, Thoreau gets in jail, and one of his friends comes to visit him in jail and says, "Thoreau, what are you doing in jail?" And Thoreau's response is, "What are you doing out of jail?" And during the Civil Rights Movement, with Montgomery and Birmingham and so many of the campaigns, and Nashville and the sit-in movement in Nashville, it became a noble gesture of kind of heroism and sacrifice to go to jail. Students would come from all over the country to go to Nashville, to train with Reverend Lawson, to go to Birmingham, to join the movement there, to march on Selma, to go to these different campaigns. And college students your age wanted to get arrested. They wanted to go to jail for freedom. It became a badge of honor. How many times have you been arrested for freedom? And I watched all the movies, some of the movies that we're going to watch in this class as a teenager. And when I was 18 years old, my poor parents, I couldn't wait to go to find a protest to go get arrested at, I mean, I was in jail, as soon as I was 18, I was in jail, at a protest, and I did it a lot in my 20s, mostly for peace, mostly in anti-war, mostly anti-nuclear war, disarmament protests as a young man. But I grew up reading Thoreau and King, and they made it to if the society is wrong, you have to take a risk. Nowadays, a lot of cities are trying to pass laws against peaceful nonviolent protest. They're actually trying to make the kind of protest that King engaged in more or less illegal in a lot of towns. Like, for example, one of the most popular forms of protest is a blockade. And so now they're making, if you block traffic, it's legal to run you over. So that's the kind of stuff that we're dealing with today. The legacy, we haven't won. The legacy is contested, and this issue is fraught with difficulties. But you don't get a Martin King unless a young Martin is going to Morehouse. By the way, Morehouse College, Crozer Seminary, Boston University, 3 college degrees by the time he was in his early 20s, and reading people like Thoreau. When he was at, I believe it was when he was at Crozer. It's on page 23, actually. I'll open up our book. If you have your book with you, the autobiography, turn with me to page 23. I want to read you this great passage here. Yeah, he's still at Crozer Seminary, so he's graduated Morehouse. He went to Morehouse when he was 15. I found a tape, actually, of Benjamin Mays, who was one of his teachers at Morehouse, and Mays is now passed on. He said Martin got there at 14, but basically he skipped some grades in school, and so he was a college student, an undergrad, during the years that you all would have been in like 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. And so by the time he's going to seminary, he's like normal college student age. So he's like 19 maybe around this time. In the middle of page 23, and in the paragraph before that, he's reading Nietzsche. Nietzsche and King are not compatible. Nietzsche was one of these great philosophers that King read to figure out what he doesn't believe. Nietzsche considered Christians to be weak. I'm going to go off on a slight little tangent here. Okay, so James Cone, I'll mention him later, was one of the great black theologians that came after King. He taught what was called black liberation theology. He wrote a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. There's been a lot of good scholarship. Now, if this is the first time you've heard this, I'm sorry if I'm shocking your world or whatever. But there's a lot of good scholarship today that would say that Jesus was probably a person of color. Okay, some people say definitely has African in him, but he's definitely not like as fair-skinned as I am. Okay, he's Middle Eastern descent. Palestinian Jew, right? He's probably brown, if not black. It's really bizarre that like some white supremacists now aren't Christians anymore because they don't want to worship a brown person. So they're now worshiping these like Nordic pagan Viking gods, because they think that religion is more compatible with their racist beliefs. But some of the things that Nietzsche said about Jesus reminds me of what some of these white nationalists say, is that he's weak, that anybody who gets crucified is weak. And so what King really had to wrestle with is what is the true message of Christianity? And I'm going to say a lot about that today. But so he jumps from paragraph to paragraph. He goes from Nietzsche to Gandhi, just like that. Okay? I'm going to read in the middle of the page here. If you've got your book, you can read along. It says, then one Sunday afternoon, I traveled to Philadelphia to hear a sermon by Dr. Mordecai Johnson, president of Howard University. Hopefully you all recognize that name. He was there to preach for the Fellowship House of Philadelphia. Dr. Johnson had just returned from a trip to India, and to my great interest, he spoke about the life and teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. His message was so profound and electrifying that I left the meeting and bought 6 books on Gandhi's life and works. So I've mused. I'm sure that King would have found the Indian revolutionary Gandhi on his own, but I just keep thinking about this day. What if Dr. King hadn't gone to Philadelphia that afternoon to hear Mordecai Johnson preach on Gandhi? What if King hadn't taken home all these Gandhi books? Gandhi becomes huge. King thought Gandhi was a Christian, Gandhi was a Hindu, right? But Gandhi, according to King, understood Jesus at such a profound level that he thought of Gandhi as a Christian. He said, like most people, I'd heard of Gandhi, but I'd never studied him seriously. As I read, I became deeply fascinated by his campaigns of nonviolent resistance. I was particularly moved by his salt march to the sea and his numerous fasts. And the whole concept of satyagraha, satya, which equals love, and graha, force, which means truth force or love force, was of profound significance to me. It's come to be called soul force. I love that. And so the English word, nonviolence, is inadequate to express what King was about. He was about soul force, love force, truth force. This is the power of nonviolence that King was interested in. He actually says in here in the book that he used to think the 5th chapter of Matthew only applied to interpersonal relationships. One of my Bible scholars helped me out here. What's in the 5th chapter of Matthew? The Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, sometimes called Jesus' inaugural address. What else is in the Sermon on the Mount besides the beauty of the Beatitudes is, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You've heard it said, love your friends, hate your enemies. I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. King originally thought that ethic of love was like when Logan and I have an argument, that we still love each other as brothers, right? When my wife and I get into a fight, that it still is important that we love each other. If I get into a disagreement with one of the elders at my church, that we remember that we're still, kinfolk and siblings in Christ, and that we need to work it out. And that he didn't believe you could apply the Sermon on the Mount to every situation, that it was a private ethic. There are still churches today that will teach that as orthodox doctrine, that the Sermon on the Mount doesn't apply outside of private personal relationships. It took a man from India named Gandhi for King to believe that the Sermon on the Mount is a world ethic, a nation ethic, a societal ethic, an ethic that applies to institutions, that applies to the buses in Montgomery, we're going to find out, that applies to the Ku Klux Klan, that applies to the war in Vietnam, that applies to the laws that made it so when you went to vote in Selma, you had to take a quiz before you could vote. And if you failed the quiz, they wouldn't give you a ballot. I mean, the kind of institutionally racist and violent policies of his government that he became an opponent of, a protest agent of, a resistor of, were in fact violations of the teachings of Jesus. This is how radical King is. He said, and I love this because, King is what we will call a theological liberal, and I'll go into a little bit more depth in just a minute about what I mean by that. But a lot of times, you'll hear a theologian, and maybe this is just my bias because I'm in the theological mainline in a liberal denomination, but you'll hear theological conservatives say, oh, you're just only taking part of the Bible. You got to take the whole Bible. You got to read the whole thing literally. And it's like, I just want one of those people to go and apply the Sermon on the Mount to the wall, or the Matthew 25 to the wall. I mean, it's just so, if you actually started, and I'm not saying everything is kumbaya, summer of love, but when my friends Calvin and Nelia were here in the 60s at Tech, and they were kind of like Jesus hippies, the Jesus hippies had a few things figured out correctly. This love thing is serious work, and it's very, very, very radical. And so King takes Gandhi's ethic of love, this idea of soul force, and is trained in it academically as a seminary student about your age. And so then when he gets to Montgomery, and when we get to Montgomery next week and we actually have to apply it, he's actually going to be equipped to apply it because he's actually studied it and trained in it. But this is the idea of love in action, love out loud in public, love in policy. This is saying, that you don't leave your doctrine in the pulpit on Sunday, but you walk your talk, you practice what you preach on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and that institutions like universities and governments and corporations have to have a moral ethic. It's profound. Profound. So, when King is identifying as a theological liberal in the in the 40s and the early 50s when he's training, so it's really probably late 40s through the mid 50s when he's getting his training, we have to understand that the term liberal in all the contexts, maybe not all, but most of the contexts that King is using it, is not what we are accustomed to thinking today. Today, liberal has been sort of dumbed down. It maybe means, member of the Democratic Party. It maybe means pro-choice, on abortion or something like that. They've when it's been used in a negative way, it means big government, meaning you want to spend a lot of money. It means high taxes. I mean, the conservative movement, to its success, has demonized liberalism and has made a caricature of liberalism in the United States. But it was a small L liberalism that was widespread in 20th century academia, and it was in the church, and it was everywhere. This was modernism. And one of the ways in which King was a theological liberal and not a literalist is shocking to some fundamentalists and evangelicals of any generation. But it says in our textbook, that he got up in Sunday school class and said maybe the resurrection is a metaphor, or maybe the resurrection is was a spiritual resurrection. So Christian doctrine teaches in a literal bodily resurrection, and King questioned that. King questioned the Virgin Mary, that whole edifice of doctrine. And when we got back from Memphis last spring, and it was a earth-shattering, life-changing time to be in Memphis during the 50th commemoration of the assassination, and to hear all these great preachers and social reformers of our day, as well as some of the people that were there with King, 50 years ago. Some religious groups did some conferences, and apparently there was a fairly conservative Baptist group that decided to have their own kind of Christian King conference in Memphis around that time. And I found this talk online just the other day. I was doing some research for this course, but I was just kind of getting refreshed. And there's a guy, on the internet with this 20-minute YouTube. Martin Luther King Jr. is a Christian heretic. He's not really a Christian. And this is the kind of stuff that they're bringing up, was this, idea in reading the Bible as true morally and true theologically, but not necessarily a book of historical facts, not reading the Bible as a science textbook. And so today you can go to Kentucky and you can go to the Noah's Ark Museum and you can learn in the literal flood and all this kind of stuff. And if you're into that reading of Scripture, I don't in any way want to kind of, we had that argument in Bible is Lit. That's not the purpose of this course. I don't want to go off on that tangent too far, other than to explain that King wanted his religion to be modernist and open-minded and available to academic evidence, right? And so when he questions things like the virgin birth and the literal and the bodily resurrection, he was just in a stream of liberal Christian modernism that was very popular at that time and that was very, very compelling to him. Going along with that debate between literalism and liberalism. Now, you understand when I say literalism, this is the idea that, the Bible says it, that settles it, right? So you've heard that growing up here in the South. Some of you are from the South, gone to conservative churches as a child. So you understand that idea in a literal Bible, right? So the theological liberalism that King was steeped in as an academic in seminary and such was pushing back on that a little bit, but it was by no means, I think he would still say the Apostles' Creed or something. I don't think he's saying it's not true. He's just saying it's true in a different way than scientific fact is true. And that ability intellectually to wear a theological lens and a scientific lens at the same time, and to allow those to inhabit your mind and your body at the same time, that's not that strange. I mean, this is Tennessee Tech. This is a very academic, science-based institution. We have engineers and chemists and people who do really advanced science, and they understand that the discipline of science and the discipline of theology are different disciplines. And that's not to say that we live a life that's compartmentalized into these categories, but that we have dialogue between those different parts of our intellects and different disciplines in society in a respectful way. And so King was very much a modernist and a small L theological liberal. One of the other issues that King wrestles with as a young man, and I just like to drop big seminary words on you now, but is the dialogue between transcendence and imminence. Anybody want to take a stab for me at what would be the and when talking about God, what would be the difference between transcendence and imminence? Is anybody familiar with these vocabulary words? Anybody want to take a stab? Okay, I'm going to break it down for you. Hello, I'm walking away from the video here. God up here. This is a vertical relationship. It's hierarchical. Humanity down here. This is a very traditional theism. If your transcendence is really strong, God is wholly other. God is wholly different. God is always above. God is always transcendence. Christians are Trinitarians, and I believe that King is a Trinitarian, but we get through the person of Jesus, we get very interested in imminence. And this is the kind of overlap between God and humanity. And many Christians are not only interested in the transcendent God, God the Creator, God the Father, as you might call that entity. And they're not purely interested in imminence, because if you're interested in only imminence, maybe Jesus is, just a guy, or maybe we're all Jesus, maybe we're all divine. Christianity doesn't teach that. Maybe you run into pantheism. There's all kinds of, places you can go. If you're a theological liberal, you can go all kinds of places. Once you start talking about the presence of God here in the now, you can go all kinds of places. But King was really wrestling at that time with the tension between imminence and transcendence. There's this great little passage at the end of the section on Crozier on page 29 where King talks about seeing God in nature. Every day I would sit on the edge of the campus by the side of the river and watch the beauties of nature. My friend, in this experience I saw God. I saw him in birds of the air, the leaves of the tree, the movement of the rippling waves. Sometimes I go out at night and look up at the stars, and they bedeck the heavens like shining silver pins sticking in a magnificent blue pincushion. This is God, or there is God. So God's handiwork, the Creator's creation, is a revelation of the immanence of God, the ever-present right here-ness of God. Personalism, and I wish I could do a better job on this, and I also, for the sake of time, won't stay here too long, but I want you to be at least aware that there was a school of theologians in Boston that he studied with at Boston University called the Personalists, and this is the idea that God has a personality. And he wrote his dissertation, which I'll reference again in a minute, between a dialogue between a personalist theologian and a theologian of kind of radical imminence called Paul Tillich. Paul Tillich had this saying that God is the ground of all being. That is this idea of this kind of everywhereness of God. But something that King gets from his being reared in the African-American church and in the black church is this idea of a very personal God. That God is a personality. God is a person. Trinitarians say God in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.